Inside this dusty ledger lies a secret ritual that history tried to bury. It's called corrective assignment. While Roman masters used iron chains to bind the body, modern masters use something far more sinister: the erasure of a woman's identity through paper and debt. Today, we reveal how the private lives of women are still being auctioned in a system that makes the ancient whip look merciful. They opened the ledger on a sun-warmed table, and with a single line of ink, a life was reclassified. The book was larger than it looked from across the room, its spine softened by years of handling, its leaves thin with dust. When the cover eased back, the smell of old paper rose, dust and ink, and the faint tang of something metallic, a memory of coin. In the margins, a thin hand had made notations, small crosses, a shorthand initial, a smudge where a finger had lingered. On the facing page, neat columns marched downward: rations, labor, fines, and between those columns, in a darker, heavier stroke, a word that would change the shape of a household: corrective assignment. That ledger would not lash or brand. It would not advertise its power in public squares. Its force was quieter, bureaucratic, and procedural. Its violence administered in forms meant to feel inevitable, rational, recorded. It was the instrument by which the household turned private bonds into entries, private intimacies into obligations. It is here, in the ledger's columns and margins, that we find how modern masters, literal and figurative, sometimes do what earlier punishments did not. They transform a woman's private personhood into an item to be accounted for, regulated, and inherited by paper. If you want more archival reconstructions like this, subscribe and support preservation efforts. Amina lived within the orbit of that ledger. She was not famous. She did not have a public name in state records. In the household papers, she appears as a line in a margin, a stitched cuff tucked into a bundle of clothing, a folded letter found beneath floorboards. The reconstruction that follows comes from those small material traces, read alongside ledger entries, stewardly memoranda, and the careful notes of archivists who have worked to make sense of what the books do not say out loud. Consider the household itself as a miniature jurisdiction: steward, overseer, minister, scribe. The steward managed daily provisioning, the overseer supervised fields and labor, the minister pronounced moral status and ritual purity, the scribe translated both into the book. Together they formed a compact administrative authority, an apparatus that could define who belonged where, who ate what, and which relationships counted as legitimate. Within that space, a ledger functioned simultaneously as an account book and a moral register. The two functions fed one another. To be registered as deficient in the columns was to be marked as morally suspect. To be noted as suspect was to be assigned corrective measures in the ledger. Paper and principle reinforced each other until the household's versions of order and virtue mattered more than the persons they regulated. This is not to say the ledger acted by itself. The record suggests a ritualized moment where discovery met doctrine. The inciting incident reconstructed from the documents is small and private: a folded scrap, an inked line different from the owner's normal hand, a neighbor's whisper. The steward's memorandum paraphrases a finding, the minister's notes sketch a ritual response, and the scribe's hand produces the formal entry that would codify the household's decision. In place of a public trial, there is a ritual that blends spiritual language and administrative force. A coin is exchanged, a prayer is offered, a pen marks a corrective assignment. Corrective assignment in these pages does not, in the primary evidence, mean a whip or an official courtroom sentence. Instead, it entailed administrative seizure, the reallocation of space, food, names in the register, and oversight over movement and correspondence. Beds were reassigned, rations columns adjusted, children's names moved into different accounts, sometimes under different familial designations. Correspondence was read, censored, or redirected. Visitors were limited, remittances rerouted. Where earlier punishments might have left scars on the body, this administration stamped the person into systems that would shape her daily life and that of her descendants. Look closer at the margins. They tell another story. Among the ledger's neat columns, Amelia, an archivist who worked with the book, found a folded letter, its edges worn smooth by being hidden and unfolded again. The letter, reconstructed by paraphrase across a string of notes, speaks of longing, of a plan to leave, of a name written by someone called Daniel. Daniel was a field hand. In his letters he appears as intimate and practical, offering small comforts and the risk of a life outside the household's jurisdiction. The paper had been folded to fit into a seam. When Amelia unfolded it during a conservation session, she found beneath the paper a tiny patch of thread where a cuff had been stitched to keep something, perhaps a token, perhaps a name, from falling away. Material traces like that stitched cuff tell of quiet resistances. Amina did not, according to the ledger, make open rebellion. She made stitches. She hid notes. She kept lists of names in the linings of garments. The household systems were powerful, but they were not total. The record indicates pockets of aid. A neighbor slipping an extra ration into a basket, an overseer turning a blind eye at crucial moments, a letter deliberately missing from the steward's pile. Those acts of everyday solidarity do not always appear in the ledger, but they leave other traces: frayed hems, mismatched buttons, entries corrected in darker ink where a hand later tried to undo or obscure a line. The scribe's ink read "Corrective Assignment" beside Amina's name. The record suggests the process that followed: an assessment by the steward, who reallocated rations, a note by the minister that supervised movement should be imposed, and an entry in the register that redirected the accounting of any children nominally attached to Amina into a column labeled differently, not Amina's household, but dependents under supervision. Through those administrative acts, Amina's family relations were legally and materially reconfigured. In practice, this meant her child's allowance, apprenticeship prospects, and social recognition could be rerouted by the ledger's decisions, for as long as the household maintained its accounts. The reach of the ledger extended beyond a single season. Where corporal punishment was episodic and local, paper endured. A later clerk, perhaps working without the context of the original incident, would read the ledger and take the entries as given. Each time a steward transferred assets, the ledger's prior lines informed new calculation. The administrative mark, once made, accumulated authority through repetition. Records beget other records. Children registered as dependents under supervision might later be excluded from inheritance columns or recorded as the responsibility of another household line. Over years, the ledger's entries coalesced into genealogical erasure, names missing, family ties redirected, the sense of belonging rearranged by columns and by the assumptions later clerks read into them. If this sounds like an abstract mechanism, the material artifacts bring it home. Professor Andrews, who has studied household accounts, pointed to a set of ration columns where an entire series of entries had been redrawn in a different ink. The older ink, faded and careful, recorded children as part of Amina's household. The later stroke, heavier and authoritative, crossed those names into a separate ledger line. That heavier line did not note why the change was made. The notation that would explain motive is absent. Yet the effect is clear. The household's accounting now treated those children as not belonging under Amina's charge. The ledger does the reassigning with the same economy that a law book performs. No violence, just an entry that changes status. This is the horror of administrative force. It turns human lives into units to be sorted, resorted, and passed along in a bureaucracy. It promises rationality and order while creating new hierarchies of dependency and legitimacy. It formalizes shame and marginalization so that they are no longer purely social acts, but properties enforced by record. The ledger does not need to shout. Once the ink has dried, it will be used again and again as the basis for decisions about food, shelter, and standing. There were, however, other strands to the story. Investigators working through the papers, the careful field notes of Lewis, who traced patterns across multiple household ledgers, began to notice repetitions. Lewis found the same phrasing, the same procedural form: discovery, ministerial admonition, corrective assignment recorded in the ledger, followed by the practical steps of reallocation. Where the instruments differ from more overt coercions is in their durability and their capacity to reach into civil status and kinship. The pattern repeated across households in similar registers suggests an administrative logic rather than isolated cruelty. A mechanism designed to make certain relationships invisible, inconvenient, or costly. That pattern is not spelled out in a single sentence anywhere. It shows up in the accumulation of entries. The resistance within that accumulation, however, also reveals itself in the margins. A letter hidden in a seam, a cuff stitched with a name, a neighbor's pencil note tucked into a quire. These are hints that the ledger never had total dominance. Amina's repairs, literally and metaphorically, speak to survival tactics that leave non-documentary traces. They are the other side of institutional memory, the parts most likely to be erased because they exist in cloth and muscle and the memory of community exchange. They also indicate that the ledger's reach could be contested. When women like Amina found ways to conceal a name or misplace a token, they were undermining the ledger's authority in practical ways. Those acts did not always change the formal entries, but they changed how the ledger's consequences played out on the ground. Over time, the household's administrative decisions generated secondary harms. Genealogical lines were rerouted in ways that altered futures. The ledger, acting as both witness and judge, created obligations that could be enforced by subsequent stewards, and even by other households who consulted the register. A child recorded under one column could find access to apprenticeship or dowry funds redirected. A woman recorded as under supervision might find herself barred from living arrangements or social remedies. The harm was not a single cruel event. It was a structural condition that unfolded as records were read, reread, and consulted. That is the cumulative climax of this reconstruction. The ledger's bureaucratic takeover of intimate life. When a household converts a relationship into an entry, it is converting a living bond into a set of obligations and restrictions that travel across time. Paper multiplies. Later clerks take earlier lines at face value. Rituals cloak administrative acts in moral language, making them feel both sanctified and inevitable. The ledger becomes the instrument that outlives a lash. At this point, we need to address what the title asks us to consider. What does it mean to say that what modern masters do in private can be worse than ancient punishments? The historical case of Amina and the ledger is our primary evidence. Any comparison to contemporary practice must be framed as analytic parallel, an interpretation of mechanism rather than a claim of direct continuity. As an analytic parallel, consider how modern administrative systems, whether corporate human resources, medical records, digital platforms, or governmental databases, can perform a similar conversion of intimacy into data. Where the household scribe reclassified a child in a column and altered ration marks, a modern system can reclassify a relationship in a database field, tag a person under a status code, or redirect benefits through an algorithmic rule. The mechanisms are analogous: discovery, adjudication, often by non-human processes, reclassification, and consequence. The modernity of the tools does not fundamentally change the harm of turning private life into entries that then determine access and recognition. Imagine, hypothetically and without alleging specific actors, a woman whose family relationships are indexed in multiple systems: health records, benefits databases, employment files. An administrative flag, perhaps coded under a familiar bureaucratic category, could limit access to certain programs, subject correspondence to review, or influence custody-like decisions by virtue of what the record indicates about her household status. Unlike the one-off violence of public punishment, administrative actions can ripple through multiple institutions. A ledger entry in one office becomes a data point referenced by another. The harm is systemic and often invisible. It persists beyond the immediacy of any single encounter. Digitalization amplifies this dynamic. Records move faster and are copied more broadly. A single administrative classification can cascade through cross-referenced systems, eligibility checks, background assessments, automated decisions. Once a line of code or a field is set, reversing it can become bureaucratically and technically complex. The impulse toward datafication, to reduce lives to discrete, searchable attributes, grants authorities a different kind of power. It can sanitize decisions with the veneer of objectivity while still producing outcomes that feel morally punitive and socially excluding. The point is not to equate archive with algorithm in crude terms or to accuse specific modern institutions of identical cruelty. The point is to illuminate the mechanism. Administrative record-keeping and classification can be instruments of control as much as they are instruments of order. They can regulate mobility, intimacy, recognition, and legacy in ways that are less visible and, in some ways, more enduring than episodic punishments. They can also be resisted by preserving alternative records, by preserving material evidence, by contesting entries and insisting on narrative context. There are modern forms of resistance worth noting. In the historical record, Amina's stitched cuff and hidden letters resisted erasure. Today, acts of resistance take different shapes. People contesting records, advocates preserving community archives, journalists and scholars digitizing vulnerable materials, and legal frameworks that insist on rights to correction and redress. These contemporary responses mirror the older tactics of concealment and mutual aid, even as they operate in different registers and with different resources. Throughout this reconstruction, it is crucial to keep two kinds of caution in view. First, the ledger's narrative is built from fragments. The records indicate patterns. They do not always narrate motivations clearly. The interpretation offered here reconstructs context based on repeated administrative forms and material traces. but it does not pretend to recover interior lives with certainty. Second, analogies to present-day practices are interpretive comparisons. They are useful for thinking about mechanisms of administrative harm, not for making definitive claims about specific contemporary actors. What then are the ethical implications of what we have just traced? There are several. One is archival. The preservation of material evidence matters. Paper, thread, and hidden letters are witnesses where official narratives may erase. Supporting archives, local, family, and institutional, contributes to our capacity to reconstruct injustices and resist genealogical erasure. Another is public memory. Acknowledging the administrative mechanisms of harm helps us name how control operates so that remedies can be imagined beyond the binary of public punishment and private autonomy. A final implication concerns collective responsibility. Bureaucracy often claims neutrality. That claim is political. When administrative instruments are accepted without scrutiny, when entries are treated as incontrovertible, or when ritual language masks allocative decisions, we accept a system that can perpetuate marginalization. To contest that requires multiple strategies: supporting archival work, demanding transparency in record-keeping, strengthening procedural rights to correction, and sustaining community networks that preserve alternative accounts. Before we close, return with me to the stitched cuff. It is a small object, a fragment of cloth with 6 neat stitches and a threadbare name on the inside. On the front, it bears the faint mark of a ledger number, as if at one point someone tried to reconcile the wearer with the account book. To an administrator, it might look like a minor discrepancy to be corrected. To anyone who reads it differently, it is evidence of a life-claiming continuity, in spite of bureaucratic attempts at erasure. The cuff is a witness in cloth. It testifies to persistence. The ledger will remain in its archive, bound and catalogued, a record of the forms by which a household regulated intimacy and assigned obligation. The stitched cuff will remain, too, and with it the material proof that people resisted in ways that did not always make it into the margins. Together they teach us that administrative power is not only about efficiency, it is also about the rights and recognitions that records grant or withhold. When we consider modern systems, databases, HR forms, record-keeping protocols, we should ask, what do they register and what do they erase? What relationships do they make legible or illegible? How might a line drawn in a field today determine someone's life tomorrow? If you have been moved by Amina's story and by the ledger's quiet force, support local archives and preservation efforts. Share this story and leave a reflection below on what surprised you or what you learned. Preservation is not only a matter of guarding paper, it is a civic act that tests how we remember, who we acknowledge, and who we allow to vanish from our shared records. The stitched cuff remains folded in a box in the archive, its 6 stitches a small, stubborn ledger of survival. It is both a denial and a promise, a denial of complete erasure and a promise that memory, even when constrained by ink and column, finds ways to persist.